welcome to What's the Game. On today's show, it is the eve of the NBA Finals, and Jake Coyne joins the show for a deep dive into what lessons we can learn about building a championship roster in the age of parity. We ask whether the clock has run out on the Denver Nuggets title window for the current core. I'm Grace Jean, here with our special guest and new friend of the show, Jake Coyne, aka the Stats Squatch. How are you doing today, Jake?
Doing really well, guys. Happy to be here. Happy to chat. Always a busy time of year.
Yeah, I bet, especially, around NBA playoff time. We have a lot to get into in today's show. We will be talking about the actual basketball games once the finals start, talking X's and O's, all that fun stuff. Next week, I'm very excited to announce that we are going to have Denver Stiffs legend Jeff Morton on the show to ask about the curious case of Josh Kroenke, the Nuggets, the current, acting governor of the Denver Nuggets, and what he's getting up to. And we'll talk a little bit about what's going on behind the scenes with the Nuggets in this show when we talk about the lack of a general manager. Please do us a favor and hit the like and subscribe buttons. It really helps us out with the algorithm. We're still trying to grow the channel. We've got our 1,000 sub goal by the end of the playoffs, and we're currently at 934. So I actually think we could do it if you guys help us out. So again, hit that subscribe button, hit the like button on the video as well, and definitely hit the notification bell so that you don't miss our content. Well, since we've already alluded to a little bit of, what your connection is to Nuggets fandom in, your drafting of this 50-page off-season guide, let's talk about that part of your background a little bit, Jake. How did you become a Nuggets fan in the first place? And then maybe you could tell our audience a little bit about what inspired your, transformation into a sort of NBA salary cap and draft nerd, and what inspired you to write this annual Nuggets off-season guide.
Yeah. So, I grew up in Denver and have always loved sports, playing and watching them. But I'd say kind of what made me the biggest Nuggets fan was Carmelo Anthony and J.R. Smith.
We get that answer a lot.
That I just loved watching. Got me so excited growing up to watch every Nuggets game just to see what those guys would do. So it made it a really enjoyable experience. And then kind of as time went on, the thing that sort of got me into CBA stuff was actually, what year would it have been? Probably the mid-2010s.
Did they do something dumb? Did the front office do something dumb and you were like, what is going on here?
Well, they had tried to do something. So what had happened was they were trying to re-sign Kenneth Faried to an extension. Okay. And there was some reports that came out with some numbers. It was like, oh, it's 5 years and some number. And then they drew back on those reports and they said, oh, no, that was actually an illegal contract they were trying to give Faried. Because at the time, you couldn't extend a guy 5 years on a rookie contract unless it was a max deal. And so the Nuggets, for whatever reason, the reports came out that they were trying to do something illegally there, right? And so that's kind of what got me into the CBA originally. Was I was curious about, like, why did that happen? What were they thinking of doing? And so then you kind of dig into it, you start reading it, you start looking at resources online, and it just became something I really enjoyed doing and being able to talk to people about. And then it kind of formed into what it is now, which is some of these reports that I put out. And I do it, a lot of it's just to try and kind of help educate people, I think. I don't like discourse that's just really uninformed about things that could never happen. And
I feel that.
So if I can, put in a few hours on my end to try and help educate people on some of these rules, maybe some of the things the Nuggets might be thinking, that's always been worthwhile to me. And so
because it helps elevate the discourse that you have with people as well. Because it's not that, any fan can have a good idea, but their idea can be even better informed if they understand the rules of engagement, right?
Yep, exactly. And, I've always enjoyed talking about how to build these teams and stuff. It's really fun to me. And so being able to sort of elevate that level of discourse has always been worth it to me and enables me to go on to this show and go on to other shows and just be able to talk basketball, which is ultimately one of my favorite things to do.
Yeah, absolutely. I like fully relate to that. Actually, so since we're on the topic, I actually forgot to mention this in the programming notes. We're not going to talk about this piece on the show, but I actually decided to write an article. I was inspired by Zeke Najee's contract. So I actually wrote a whole piece about the pitfalls of long-term contracts sort of broadly under the new CBA. So if anybody that is interested in that can check it out. It's not Nuggets specific. I use Zeke Najee's contract as a case study to talk about trends more broadly throughout the league, and I use other contracts as examples throughout. I'll link that in the description of the show as well, so you guys can check that out. If you do want us to have a show where I talk about just what's going on with Zeke Najee's contract and long-term contracts, we can do that. I don't know that our audience wants me to nerd out quite to that extent, but I am excited to have Jake on the show to sort of touch on similar topics, because we are actually going to talk about some of the example mock off seasons that Jake has in his off season guide, and talk about some of the suggestions that he has for the team, including some listener questions that we got before the show. But thanks for sharing your background, Jake. All right, let's move on to our first segment here. The curious case of the Denver Nuggets general manager, a whodunit, or rather a who is it? Because we still don't have a general manager. It has been 57 days since Denver had a GM, since Josh fired Calvin Booth. We've heard reports and speculated that it might just be Ben Tenzer, who was named interim GM after that firing, and who, according to Josh, has done a, quote, unbelievable job over the last 2 months doing things. And we've also speculated that the GM could be someone else, or that they could, in fact, hire somebody external to take over a sort of supervisory president of basketball operations gig to sort of be figurehead, basically, above Ben, and sort of mediate any disputes and sort of what's the word that Josh used? Policing the culture in the organization. But, it's interesting because Josh said we don't need a total cultural reset, but maybe we need a chaperone is what I took from that. But honestly, I'm still not convinced that the next general manager isn't just going to be Ben Tenzer. So, Jake, I ask, what is taking them so long to draft Ben Tenzer's intro package?
Well, I think if you were to ask, the most skeptic Nuggets fan, I guess, I think they would tell you that decision's already been made and that it is going to be Tenzer.
That's me. I'm the most skeptic.
And that they're sort of delaying it to maybe put on a appearance of a really thorough search when perhaps it hasn't been as thorough as some people would like. If you ask my opinion, do I think Tenzer is going to be the next GM? I do. However, I don't know that there's been a decision made yet on if there will be someone above him. And I think that's maybe where they're looking right now is, do we want to bring in a Matt Lloyd from Minnesota, put him as our president of basketball operations, and then put Tenzer right below him as our GM? I think that's probably what they're looking at still. And it may end up just being Tenzer and no one else above him. But I do think they probably are still thinking about how can we bring in someone to put above him. And, the Timberwolves weren't eliminated that long ago. So those conversations could still be happening. And so if you want to look at things from a little bit more of a hopeful perspective, I would say that's probably it. However, at the end of the day, I would say I'd be surprised if Tenzer is not some type of decision maker for the Nuggets next season, whether that's the top one or right below it.
Yeah, I think I agree with you that the decision's probably already been made, and Josh has sort of been. We've gotten 3 press conferences from Josh over the last 2 months, and 2 of them have been, unbelievably glowing. About Ben Tenzer. In the most recent one, the introductory press conference for new head coach David Adelman. He talked about how Ben has all these ideas about how the front office can improve internally and externally. And so feels like he's sort of planting the seeds for like, this guy's great, guys, I promise, and he's just sort of, waiting for that moment.
I would say,
oh, go ahead.
Sorry to butt in on you, but just kind of piggybacking off that, Tenzer, he's helped with a lot of stuff in the G League and stuff, more like player development type things. So I do think if we're looking at different styles of GMs, and Josh truly believes in his heart that the best way forward is sort of internal development, Tenzer does make a lot of sense if that's what you're doing. Yeah. Even if, you say, I would prefer somebody that's really connected with agents, and maybe has a little bit more of an outside perspective on things. That's just me, though. And, if Josh thinks internal development is the path, I think that Tenzer makes a lot of sense for that.
Yeah, and I think, and this is going to help lead us into our next topic here. The thing that people really want to have with an outside perspective is just being able to look at the roster a little bit in a little bit more cold and calculated terms than we have when we're talking about a GM who might, has been here his entire career, from the time he was interning around college time, and has a few less attachments to various players on the roster and can sort of assess where we're at here. We have a comment. The Nugs need to get someone with a Brooklyn Nets connection for GM. I know that'd be so great because they're the team with all the cap space this summer. We could really use those 2025 draft picks and salary cap space to dump for our bench. Well, I was thinking more about the salary cap space to dump some players there. I have this tinfoil hat theory that I shared with you, Jake, online a few weeks ago that I talked about on the show, where I think that they're going to try to use a future first to trade into this draft and also simultaneously salary dump some things. So I could actually see that exact scenario happening. So very smart, very smart viewer there. But again, tinfoil hat theory, it's not necessarily happening. It's just I'm not going to take it off the table until the draft is done because it could happen as late as actual draft night. But yeah, we want somebody who's going to be able to assess the roster in sort of colder terms. But let's talk about the actual Denver Nuggets roster, because we need to figure out what it is that this team needs, whether it's going to come from, external help or internal development, as Josh was sort of banging that drum at the last press conference. So the first question I've got for you on this, and I know it's really hard to assess because looking at the way that the Nuggets played in the playoffs versus the regular season, it's so evident that the vibes during the regular season were as low as they possibly could have been. But just based on the regular season, before we talk about the playoff needs, do you think that Denver had roster issues that were specific to the regular season, as they did clearly struggle relative to past years, and or was 80% of that or more due to the level of caring?
Yeah, I think there was regular season roster issues, and I think it can be boiled down to something as simple as your coach is trying to win games. You need to give him at least some players that he feels helps him achieve that goal. And I think Calvin Booth and the Nuggets swung so far in the direction of trying to force his hand into playing players that they thought would be good, that it created this issue of just such an imbalanced roster. We saw the starters playing together a ton of minutes once again. And we also
when they
saw,
were healthy, which was not actually all that much this
yep,
season.
and we also saw a massive disparity between like the top 7 or so players in total minutes, and then a big gap. And then you get down to like Zeke Naji and all those players. And so I think there was a roster issue in the sense that you could have balanced that a little better, even if it was just a Justin Holiday or something that you had as an option. And then, say he gets injured during the season or whatever, and then Coach Malone has to move to one of those younger guys. I mean, that's a lot more natural of a process of things than just trying to force a guy into playing these young draft picks right away on a team with such high expectations. And so, from that point of view, I would say, yeah, there was a regular season roster issue, and I think there will be going forward unless they bring in some new faces.
Yeah, and one of the things that I think I completely agree with everything that you just said, and one of the things just to play off of that a little bit is just like we had so many young guys, right? So like you can play a few like really good minutes. I put out some tweets about this a few weeks ago, but like Peyton Watson, I think, was 13th in his draft class in total minutes this season. This is a guy who went in the back of the first round, and yeah, there were some busts in that draft, but that's one of the ways I'm sort of gauging like is Malone like underplaying these young guys, quote unquote? Not really. Julian Strother also I think he was 16th in his draft class in total minutes, which is even more surprising to me because I think he struggles more defensively than a lot of guys in his class, and that was also a pretty rich draft class in 2023 as well. So he's playing more than guys that some of the names surprised me in that sense. Peyton Watson is playing just a little bit less than Jabari Smith Jr., who was the 3rd overall pick in that draft. But then when you get to like, well, we have to play Peyton Watson, and we have like when you're trying to get the coach to play Peyton Watson, Julian Strother, Jalen Pickett, Hunter Tyson, all these guys that need like developmental reps, but they all also have to play with Jokic. But also there's this simultaneous complaints of like, well, they're not playing long enough stints, but also we need to play 11 guys. It's just like, some dueling, some conflicting sort of goals there because we have so many young guys. I do think for me, the main regular season gap, I think that I saw, obviously the defensive side of the ball was the more sort of resonant issue during the regular season because it was effort and execution to a pretty high degree, but I felt we lacked high motor defensive players. It was interesting because early in the season it felt like Russell Westbrook was our best defender for some reason. That wasn't necessarily a good thing because he's good, but he like comes off the bench. He's 36 years old, all of this stuff, right? And that's one of those things that helps you get through the regular season because you've got this guy that's willing to do the fly around stuff, that's willing to chase guys over screens, all this stuff. It felt like on every play where there was a breakdown, everybody just gave up.
Yep.
And that was both effort, but also I think that's where, you don't necessarily think of KCP as that guy, but he was a pretty high mode. Like he was ready to get those offensive foul calls on moving screens every single night. Like he's fighting through those things constantly. And for the people that are like, well, they couldn't keep KCP. He was too expensive, all this stuff. I'm not saying that they needed to keep KCP, but I think that was a miscalculation that they made when they didn't sort of backfill that within the roster. Peyton Watson can be a good defensive player, but he's not a high motor guy. Christian Brown moving into his role as a starter with starter minutes and all of that. He used to be that high motor guy off the bench, but I feel like he was sort of redistributing his efforts a little bit more in this season as he tried to sort of adapt to being a starter. And I think the defensive side of the ball definitely took the hit there as he was putting the motor all on offense and sort of being Giannis in transition in the regular season.
Yeah, and I think, just kind of watching other teams in the playoffs, and I think this applies to the Nuggets regular season as well, is I was kind of struck at just how quick some of these other teams look on defense.
Yeah.
When you think about the Nuggets starting five, uh, Jokic, MPJ, and Murray, none of those guys are quick
No.
defensively. And I would put Brown and Gordon more into a category of like disciplined and smart defenders
Yeah.
rather than
Agreed.
like quick ones. And so, yeah, I think you see that and you're like, well, our quickest defender is like Russell Westbrook, and he's in his late 30s. He might not be here next year. We'll see. Peyton Watson is definitely explosive, but I think both him and Strother to a lot greater degree, they need to work on like their defensive IQ in order to be flying around to the same degree we see some of these other players on other teams flying around defensively. And so
Yeah.
that was one thing that struck me kind of just watching all these other teams in the playoffs was I was like, man, some of these guys defensively are just flying around and making life difficult for the opposing offense. And I just don't think they haven't been like that. They don't,
Yeah.
they're very
They don't make
smart.
the opposing offense
Yes.
uncomfortable in any way
Yeah.
right now. Yeah.
I mean, they can with their length and with kind of their, intelligence defensively.
They have to
like,
actually use it
yeah.
though. Like you gotta have
Right.
active hands. You gotta fly around. And like I said with Peyton Watson, the reason I don't put him in the category of high motor, when he does play with energy, like you feel him, right? But that's not an every night thing. For example, I'm actually glad that you brought up Julian because I do think that he's got like Will hates this term when people use it. He's got like a sneaky high motor, but his body control is like non-existent. So he's just constantly flying into guys and like fouling
Yeah.
them. But yeah, that combination of, as you're saying, sort of defensive IQ and motor, we're lacking in any like one player on this roster. So, okay, let's talk a little bit about the offensive side of the ball. I think it's pretty evident that David Adelman, new head coach, who we've talked about on this show, especially after his introductory presser and some of the other media hits that he's done since he was named head coach, he has sort of emphasized that offensively, both in the regular season and the playoffs, it feels like his assessment is that the issue was effort and execution, because he's talked about we need to be better about like making contact on our screens, becoming an execution team and beating teams up with sort of rigorous, relentless execution, especially in the half court. We became a transition team for like 3/4 of this last season, right? But Adelman said that stuff really broke down in the playoffs. Actually, I'm going to transition to a bit of a question that leads us into our playoff discussion here. But is the reason that David Adelman is focusing so much on execution of these details over what a lot of people would have said they would have liked to hear out of the new head coach, which is recreating the system around Jokic and, being more, people use this word, creative with our offense? Because honestly, a lot of the most creative schemes just get scouted out in the playoffs. The Grizzlies didn't even take until the playoffs to sort of solve this revolutionary sort of pinwheel type offense that they had going on for large stretches of this season that they were receiving a lot of praise for. The Cavs, now they struggled both shooting, but and also with injuries in the playoffs. But I would also say that a lot of their motion sets that were the source of the quote unquote cavalanches that would just overwhelm teams in the regular season got scouted out, and their offense eventually devolved into Donovan Mitchell, can you get us a bucket here? And then I think the most prominent example of an explosive offense becoming easy to guard when you know the tendencies of, a system that was designed to be very creative, is the Warriors and their motion offense. And obviously it helps that they no longer have Kevin Durant next to Steph Curry, or that any other player on that team can actually looks at the rim outside of Steph Curry. But they are easy to scout, and you can everything sort of boils down to, can you execute your pick and roll that, you know, can flow out of other actions, but eventually, like, you got to get to that thing, your bread and butter.
Yes, I think when it comes to the execution thing, a lot of times we as fans will think of execution as just being in the right place at the right time, you know, running a play correctly, something like that. But I think when we talk about execution from like a coaching perspective, I think there's also like an element of just do your job on that play. And if your job on that play is to hit an open shot, like that's part of execution.
Yeah,
Is
that's true.
You need to be able to execute and hit that open shot. And so I think, you know, when David Adelman kind of talks about we need to execute better, you can look at that a lot of different ways, as not only, hey, you need to be in the right place, but also like you need to do your job on this play, which involves not turning it over. It involves hitting the shot when it comes to you. And I think for certain players on the team, it involves taking the shot when you're supposed to take it. I think there's players on the Nuggets that can be a little tight and maybe try to pass up on a good shot for what they hope will be a great shot, but it doesn't always end up coming when you wait for it like that. You know, that's when a lot of times we'll see Jamal sort of pass up on an open three and go into some of these contested twos, or we'll see Christian pass up on an open three and pass it along to the next guy.
At the end of the shot clock.
Right. Yeah, those guys
Lots
need
of
to
grenades.
execute, and they need to do what their job is on that play, and that involves being aggressive and taking that shot when it's there. And so, yeah, I think, you know, going forward for the Nuggets, they need to execute like David Adelman says. And when it comes to the playoffs, each team you play in the playoffs is going to present different issues.
Mm-hmm.
And it's your job to figure out how to solve those problems based on your personnel. And so the Nuggets have guys that are limited defensively. They have guys that can be limited offensively. And so they have to figure out how to execute with the personnel that they do have. And so that's kind of like the big issue here is, do we need different personnel to try and execute this plan? Or can we just do a better job going forward, and maybe some internal development gets us to that level?
Well, that's the big question here, right? Because, you know, going into our broader sort of roster building lessons from the playoffs, Will and I talked about this before the season, where, you know, in trying to assess the job that a coach has done, you sort of have to take a step back and ask yourself whether the general manager has done their job. And we sort of came up with a, or maybe it was just me, I can't remember, a rubric to say like, hey, like the general manager did their job. And I think that the general manager of the Denver Nuggets, their job is to put together a roster that can be reasonably expected to at least make the Western Conference Finals. And from there, it's all the players, it's all the coaches. And I say expected because if you have a roster that, you know, is of the caliber that I'm thinking of, and they have Nikola Jokic, I'm like, this team should be able to make the Western Conference Finals. I think Denver had that last year. Even though I would have wanted them to have one more piece, last year's playoff failures, I think, were a lot more about Jamal not, you know, playing to his standard and also being, you know, relatedly being injured. And the starting unit really having nothing. Like, it turned out to be one of the worst lineups played in the playoffs last year. So it's kind of a miracle that they got as far as they did. That was not the case this year, where the starters were actually pretty good. But the rest of the roster was really, really, you know, lacking in that way. I think when they lost KCP and Justin Holiday in the same summer, they lose both shooting and experience. And frankly, just like another guy that can make it so that like Peyton Watson doesn't have to play every single playoff game, because there are just going to be ones where he probably shouldn't play. But that was, again, like you alluded to earlier, that was by design. But overall, let's start with the defensive side of the ball. What was your evaluation of how the Nuggets looked in the playoffs on that side?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say um, I was pleasantly surprised with
Yeah.
how they played defensively. I would say they exceeded my expectation going into the playoffs a little bit. Um,
Do you
I
think that was
think,
more due to the effort? A lot of people have, made a lot of the new schemes that Adelman sort of tried out, especially in the OKC series. But really, I remember they came out in game one against the Clippers in a 2-3 zone that I was like, what are we doing? Because they gave up over 30 points in that first quarter. And I was like, what is going on right now? Nobody knows where to be. Um, yeah.
yeah, I think um, it's probably a lot. It's probably a combination of a lot of things. So I think there's some scheme stuff in there. I think there's some like defensive play call stuff because I think like a zone, even though I thought the Nuggets didn't play the zone very well, I think it's less taxing on Jokic.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that helps um, defensively when he has a little more energy out there.
Yeah.
Um, I think they were a lot better about getting back in transition in the playoffs than they were in the regular season. I don't know if that's scheme or if that's effort. I'd have to really go back and look at why that was the case to understand that. Um, and then I also just think that there was. So I think the teams the Nuggets played don't present all the issues that give the Nuggets the most problems defensively, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
So
I completely agree with that. That was going to be my next question, which is, does the fact that Denver played some relatively limited offenses impact your assessment of, because we're talking about the roster, our defensive personnel?
yep. Yeah. So I think like let's think about the Timberwolves, right? That's the team everybody's scared of. Uh, they can stretch you out. They have a guard in Anthony Edwards who can drive by pretty much everybody on the Nuggets roster. I don't think they played a player like that. SGA drives a lot, but I think it's a lot easier to send help for him based on your scheme than it is somebody like Edwards. And so, yeah, I think, you know, overall the defense exceeded my expectation, but I am aware of the fact that they didn't play teams that I think test them to the highest degree defensively. I think Minnesota tests them a lot. I think Golden State tests them a lot. Um, who else would I say? Those would probably be like the main two out west. I think the Lakers, maybe.
Depends on what they do,
Yeah.
because I don't think that that is a complete enough roster right now to where you can't just not even play guys off the floor, because I don't think they want to put in the guys that are behind the guys that get played off the floor,
Yeah.
given their current roster. I like that you're listing some other teams here, because my next question was, we've made this observation in the last few weeks that it seems like the East has become the high-paced offensive conference, and the Pacers have a lot to do with that, but they're not the only team that has sort of elevated the level of offensive play in the Eastern Conference. The Cavs as well. The Knicks had a really interesting sort of offensive season, and obviously the Celtics have always been around there. But the West has turned into just a bunch of defensive teams that sort of beat you up and and slow things down into the half court. Does Denver have to be more concerned with the offensive side of the ball now than really the defensive side, because they're like, look, like, we know when it comes down to it, these other teams are so defensively skewed, with not just how they play but their personnel, that we can probably figure out ways to get stops on them, but our offense has to be able to get through their defenses.
Yeah, I think it is a concern going forward. Just because of what you're saying, you look at the teams around the West. Oklahoma City isn't going anywhere. Houston, very good defensively, will probably be around for a little while. And then Minnesota, we'll see what Gobert looks like the next couple years, but they should be good defensively for a little while. And when you look at the Nuggets roster, if a team is playing you really well defensively, sometimes you just need guys that can break things down off the dribble.
Yes.
and kind of force the defense into rotation, force them into movement. And that's kind of where Jokic can expose some weak points in the defense, is when things are
Yeah.
moving around. And the Nuggets, that would be the main problem for me, is they just don't have a lot of guys that can just be like, hey, nothing's working right now. They're smothering Jokic. We need to break this defense down a little. And they just don't have a ton of that. And so I think going forward, that would probably be my main concern offensively, and maybe my main concern, on court for the team as a whole, is how can we get this team to be a little bit more stronger at attacking off the dribble, because I think it makes life easier for everybody else if they're able to do that.
I completely 1,000,000% agree with you, Jake. Our next topic was just going to be about how Adelman has identified consistent shooting as the primary skill set he'd want to add to the team. The question was about the bench, but I don't think that shooting is the biggest offensive deficit of this team, which is, pretty shocking because we don't have anybody that I trust to make a three outside of Aaron Gordon, which is, if you asked me, if I said that 2 years ago, everyone would look at me like I had three heads. But for me, it's downhill creation. Like you're saying, attacking off the dribble. I think that Russ, during his good portion of the season, and even during the Clippers series, where I think he was just great for 7 games or for 6 games because he did miss one, Bruce and Will Barton are the proof of concept of that, and how dynamic our offense can look when you have guys that can beat others off the dribble. And then you're able to take some creation burden off of both Jokic and Jamal. And then it makes it easier, as you say, to actually set up your best players to take and make easier shots, as opposed to it's constantly Jokic and Jamal 2-man game and having to kick out to guys that you do or don't trust to make a three, right? And like you're talking about having someone that can beat guys off the dribble and put the defense into rotation can actually bend the defense, whereas guys that make shots versus a defense that's trying to load up against the 2-man game, or even just against Jokic in the post, they're not going to change how they defend the 2-man game or Jokic in the post, even if those guys are making shots. And that's not a Jokic specific thing, although part of it is because they're like, well, we are just freaking terrified of that man who is the best player in the world. So we're going to do our best to try to keep it out of his hands, both figuratively and literally. But teams like the Rockets, teams like OKC, this is just how they guard. They're like, no, we're going to create our shell, and you can shoot as many threes as you want. You have to be able to break down that shell, right? So you don't have to constantly be playing into the defense's hands. Like, you don't want the defense to dictate your offense. And I feel like having more guys that could beat others off the dribble would help with that. Yeah. So I love that you brought that up. We didn't plan this, guys.
No, not at all. But I think about, from Adelman's point of view, and he obviously knows 100 times more about basketball than I ever could. But
right.
I think
like you said, I think he agrees with you that part of execution is making shots. So I think he would like to have guys that can make those shots. But I think the other part that you identified also is like not having those record scratch possessions where you should have taken an open shot and you didn't do it. Yeah. I think that's also important. But like I said, I agree with you with the off the dribble stuff, but please go on.
Yeah. And no, I was just thinking that, I think in his point of view, it's like, okay, we're going to give the Jokic Murray pick and roll maximum space to operate. And if you help over too far, we're going to hit shots, and it's going to punish you for helping too much on this. I think that's what he's thinking about in an ideal world. One thing I'd recommend, anybody listening or watching, go watch, is there's a video that was actually, narrated, or part of it was done by Johnny Bryant, who's been a head coaching candidate. And it's just about how spacing is more than just outside shooting, and spacing is also cutting and moving through the lane and things like that.
At the right time, so that you don't have two guys doing it at once while somebody's posting up, for example. But yes.
And I think that is like a very relevant thing for the Nuggets, is They are not the best shooting team either by volume, I guess you should say. They're pretty good by percentage.
At least in the
But
regular season.
yes, but they can really create more spacing by doing other things. And I think being able to attack off the dribble and also cutting are just some of those things that the Nuggets can look at and say, we can do a better job of this going forward. And then the question is, do we have the personnel to do that?
Yeah, absolutely. We have a question. Sorry, I can't see that. Okay, who are some players that you've identified who would help with creation? Sexton, does Dennis Schroeder have something left? Those are two players that I'd love to have on the Nuggets. And there are various ways to try to get them. I think Dennis Schroeder is going to be a free agent this summer. Colin Sexton, you'd probably have to trade for. But yeah, that downhill creation burden is definitely a thing. Zamora says, I agree in some sense about the dribble penetration, but Indiana, OKC, Boston have rosters full of guys who can efficiently defend, shoot, pass, and dribble. We have so many quote unquote specialists, and we've heard from Michael Malone, specialists don't play in the playoffs. Well, we had specialists playing in the playoffs, and unfortunately that didn't work out for us. I think Zamora makes a good point here, and we're going to talk about the actual, like, what to do with the roster. But something about Indiana in particular that I've been feeling, you do have some guys that do like a particular thing at a high level. But for example, Aaron Nesmith, he's a really good defender, but he's not an all NBA guy, but he can do a little bit of everything. I don't know how much I trust him to dribble, but he can slash a bit, but he can shoot, he can dribble, he can pass a little bit, and then he defends really well. And because he's not like an all NBA caliber guy at any of those things, he's on a really cheap contract. It's also I think his rookie extension, which is why it's pretty cheap. But that is, I think, part of the new meta that we're going to discuss. Obviously, Aaron Nesmith is not quite any of the Boston Celtics, who are all guys that also like do a thing at a high level, which is why all of those guys are making over $30 million a year. But the Thunder are super young. The Pacers are also pretty young, but they're not necessarily all on rookie contracts necessarily right now. I wanted to get your general opinion about where the main sort of pressure point was with Denver's playoff roster. Was it more about the performances of our top three, the 4 through 6, or the 7th through 9th guy, which for the sake of argument, we'll just say it's Julian Strawther here?
I would say in the playoffs, you're probably looking at, I would probably say 1 through 3 was the biggest pain point. It depends on kind of how you're ordering guys. Are you ordering it by who should be your 1 through 3 or who was?
Well, that's a good question. I left that open-ended.
Yeah, because Aaron Gordon was, I don't know if we'll ever see as good of a playoff run out of him as we just saw. That might have been the peak of Aaron Gordon in the playoffs. I hope not, but it might have been. But yeah, I think it was probably your top 3 guys, but you have to look at it and you have to say, why was that the case?
Yeah.
And
fair.
So, Jamal, he had a tough matchup, in that second round. That was a tough team for him to play. I think even for Jokic, it was a little bit difficult. This is not a team he's seen in the playoffs before, and he gets better as he's
not a team any of them have seen, right? That's part of the the benefit of being the young upstart.
Yep. And so
that is also the championship favorite.
Of course. We'll see. Hopefully it doesn't last too long that way. But I would say you probably needed more out of those guys. And then if you say your third guy is Michael Porter, you can include him in that quite obviously. But yeah, whatever way you want to order it, I think you needed more out of all those guys besides Aaron Gordon. And the question is, how can we make it so that they can provide more?
Yeah, I agree with that.
Or do we need to move off of them because they simply can't provide more? I think those are the questions you have to look at. And that's probably what the front office is trying to figure out right now is, can we maximize these guys by bringing in different players? Or do we need to move off of 1 or 2 of them in order to maximize our roster? And then it kind of gets you into like, oh, well, maybe if our players 6 through 9 were better during the regular season, then our 1 through 4 could have provided more in the playoffs, right? So
Yeah.
it's all kind of connected in a way, but I think you need to find a way to maximize your top end talent.
Yeah. I like how you phrased that. How can we make it so that those guys can provide more? We did need more from them, but how can we make it so that they can provide more? One of the things I felt really from early in the season. Now, look, Jamal had like his worst start to the season since like his rookie year in that first month. But one of the things that I think augmented his normal slow start to the season was how much worse the spacing was early in the year. Well, I mean, it didn't really get that much better as the season went on, but the spacing, especially in pick and roll, was very different when there were two guys that other teams were pinching in on from the nail. He's like, I can't go anywhere. And so the reads all became very different than when it was like, and I'm not saying that this would have been different with KCP here. Maybe teams just decide after last year, like, oh, we're just going to help off KCP as well. I'm not saying that would have changed, but it is very different than last year where it's like, well, we have two respected shooters in the corners. We got AG and the dunker. We can just run our thing. And I think that it complicated the reads, and that's not an excuse because it's like, well, you're a starting point guard. You got to figure it out. And so that's like the kind of thing I'm thinking about. Also, just like on court, what can we do to make those guys' lives easier? We, had a great breakdown of Jamal's great game 6 against OKC, where, his driving game was so, I think, essential to their victory in that game. But it helped that you had that stretch where you had a guy like Julian on the floor who just always knew where to be and could kind of play off of him as well. And I think part of what we're going to talk about with these questions is how the various members of this team fit together in addition to just individual performances. Awesome. Okay, everybody go follow Jake.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys. Good to talk to you.
Well, for those that have made it this far, we still have 29 people in the live chat. Thank you so much. If you do like our content, please remember to click the like button, hit the subscribe button as well, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of our content. And always remember that winning is fun and losing sucks. Because then you have to watch the Thunder and the finals.